The morning report put us at 31 ships, and I spent the first hour of my watch trying to keep it from dropping to 29. The grain hauler Pershing had blown a coolant seal in its primary heat exchange. We didn't carry the replacement she needed, and her thermal regulation system was running on a bypass that would fail inside 48 hours. 260 people were aboard, most of them too young or too old to transfer in open vacuum. 3 ships behind her, the fuel tanker Roebuck was losing pressure in its aft compartment for the 3rd time since we'd entered the Dead Star corridor, and the repair crews had stopped pretending the welds would hold. I stood at the tactical display on the bridge of the Carthage, our flagship, and sorted through options that amounted to choosing which ship would die slower. 14 months of this. 14 months since the Oregon Reach had collapsed. The stars going dark in sequence, each death pulse stripping away infrastructure humanity had built across 7 systems over 400 years. 53 ships had made it out. 22 had been lost since then. The numbers were simple. The dying was complicated. Admiral, we've received the morning correction from the cathedral. Lieutenant Booker, my senior navigation officer, held a data tablet with the latest course adjustment from the oracles. The oracles. The word still caught in my teeth after 14 months of saying it. They were navigators, human beings whose nervous systems had been genetically rebuilt to process stellar radiation as spatial data. Their modified brains could read the death pulses of collapsing stars the way a sailor reads tide charts, translating bursts of gamma and X-ray into navigational coordinates faster than conventional instruments could manage. Before the collapse in the Oregon Reach, they had been a research curiosity, an experiment in applied neuroscience. Now they were the only reason the fleet could move through Dead Star space without flying into a radiation corridor that would cook every ship in formation. They were also, according to most of the fleet's surviving population, holy. I hadn't planned that. Nobody had. But when civilization collapses and the only people who can guide you through the wreckage are men whose eyes leak light and whose voices drop into frequencies that make your bones ache, faith fills the gap faster than reason. The Oracle Church had grown up around the navigators over 14 months. By the time I understood what it meant for my command structure, priest officers were embedded on every ship, managing Oracle communications, interpreting Oracle mandates, turning course corrections into scripture. I tolerated it because it worked. A fleet of starving refugees will tear itself apart without something to believe in, and the oracles gave them direction in both senses. Every course correction was proof of divine guidance. Every safe passage through a radiation corridor was a miracle. Every dead star the fleet survived was evidence that suffering had a destination. Commander Neil Stokes managed the religion aboard the Carthage. He controlled access to the navigation cathedral, the hardened compartment deep in the ship's core where the oracles lived, wired into their signal reception arrays, maintained by medical staff and guarded by Stokes's security detail. He was a true believer with a politician's instincts, and on any subject that touched the oracles, he had more influence over my crew than I did. Put the correction on the main display, I told Booker. The new heading appeared. I studied it against the previous day's correction. 3 degrees steeper toward Galactic south. The day before, 2 degrees. The day before that, 1.5. Each correction looked routine on its own, a minor adjustment as the oracles processed new stellar data. But the trend was consistent, and it pointed in one direction. I filed it. I said nothing. The broadcast came 6 hours later. Every speaker on every ship in the fleet carried the same transmission at once. The High Oracle's voice, Malcolm Baines, though almost nobody called him that anymore, filled the bridge of the Carthage with a sound that was partly human speech and partly something lower, a subharmonic resonance carved by the modifications to his vocal architecture. His words were plain, his meaning was absolute. The fleet's divine trajectory had been confirmed. 17 days ahead lay Cradle 881, a black hole massive enough to bend visible light at distances that made navigational charts unreliable. The faithful would enter its accretion disk. They would pass through and emerge reborn. The mathematics of salvation were being transmitted to every ship's navigation station as liturgical coordinates, numbers only Oracle-modified brains could generate. On the bridge, Lieutenant Booker closed his eyes and pressed 2 fingers to his collarbone, the fleet's prayer gesture, borrowed from some half-remembered tradition that had mutated through 14 months of desperation. Around the tactical pit, 9 of the 12 officers on watch did the same. 2 kept their eyes on their stations, which might have meant discipline or private prayer. I stood at the display and watched 17 days shrink on the navigation chart as the fleet's new heading locked in. Stokes appeared on the bridge within minutes, already coordinating with priest officers on other ships through the religious communication channel that ran parallel to my military one. He moved through my bridge with the calm of a man who owned the floor, speaking to my officers in a tone that blended congratulation with instruction. When he passed me, he inclined his head with the precise respect due a military superior who served a higher authority. I went to my quarters after my watch ended, locked the door, pulled up the fleet's course logs for the past 90 days, and spread them across my personal display, one correction at a time. The line they drew through dead star space curved. Gradually, consistently, over 4 months of daily adjustments, the fleet's heading had bent toward Cradle 881. I gave the order to Lieutenant Booker at 0200, when the bridge watch was thin and Stokes was conducting a prayer service 3 decks below. Run a parallel course calculation. Conventional instruments only. I want our trajectory plotted against every oracle correction from the past 120 days. Booker looked at me the way a man looks at an officer who has just asked him to commit a crime. Under fleet religious law, supplementary navigation, any course calculation that didn't originate from the oracles was prohibited. The theology was simple. The oracles received divine guidance, and double-checking God with a compass was blasphemy. The practical argument was simple too. Conventional instruments were too slow and too limited for dead star space, so the exercise was pointless as well as sacrilegious. Admiral, if Commander Stokes finds out, Commander Stokes reports to me. Run the calculation. He ran it. The work took 2 hours because conventional stellar cartography in a dead star corridor meant using reference points that kept dying, collapsed suns throwing off residual radiation that shifted the baseline every time Booker recalibrated. But the math was straightforward once he had enough data points. The fleet's course had been adjusted 109 times in 4 months. Each correction looked routine, a small refinement to avoid radiation pockets, gravitational anomalies, rubble fields. Standard oracle navigation. But when Booker stripped out the micro-adjustments and plotted the macro trajectory, the result was a clean, smooth arc that terminated at Cradle 881's accretion disk. The decree was an announcement of a course already committed. The fleet had been aimed at the black hole for months. Each day's correction had bent the heading a fraction closer, subtly enough that no single adjustment raised alarm, cumulatively enough that reversing would now cost fuel we might not have. I summoned Stokes to my quarters. He came with the ease of a man accustomed to being consulted. I showed him Booker's calculations on the wall display, the overlaid course corrections, the macro trajectory, the convergence point. I framed it carefully. A command-level safety audit, standard due diligence for a maneuver of this magnitude. Then I asked him to explain the 4-month drift. Stokes studied the display. He was intelligent enough to understand the math and patient enough to take his time with it. When he turned back to me, his expression carried something close to pity. Admiral, you've demonstrated that the divine course was consistent across 4 months of oracle guidance. Every correction aligned with the destination revealed today. You've found confirmation and mistaken it for conspiracy. The fleet was aimed at a black hole before anyone aboard was told. The fleet was aimed at salvation before anyone aboard was ready to hear it. The oracles revealed the destination when the faithful had been prepared by the journey. The heading was always correct. The announcement was a matter of spiritual readiness. And if I reject that? His hands folded behind his back. The movement was almost gentle. Then I will pray that the crew remembers what has kept them alive. He said it with a sincerity that left no room for argument. Argument would have required him to accept that the same evidence could support a different conclusion, and his faith had already sealed that possibility shut. I could show him the numbers. I could draw him the curve. He would see Providence where I saw entrapment, and he would pity me for the limitation. He left. I sat alone with Booker's calculations still glowing on the wall, and understood that the data would save nothing. The same evidence fed both interpretations. The fleet would follow whichever reading matched its belief. I had 6 hours to consider my next move. The High Oracle took those hours from me. Baines broadcast again, every ship, every speaker, every screen. His voice carried that deep structural vibration the modifications had carved into his vocal cords, and the sound alone brought crew members to their knees in the corridors outside my quarters. He spoke about the journey. He spoke about the faith that had sustained the fleet through 14 months of dead stars. Then, with luminous fluid running from both eyes in bright threads down his cheeks, visible on every screen across the fleet, he announced that the cargo vessel Dunmore would suffer a catastrophic failure in its port engine within the hour. He named the engine. He named the failure mode. Bearing collapse in the primary turbine assembly. He named the time, 53 minutes from that moment. 53 minutes later, the Dunmore's port engine bearing collapsed. The ship lost thrust on one side and yawed hard into the formation before her crew, already braced by the warning, fought her straight. 12 people were injured in the lurch. The ship survived on auxiliary power. Barely. I watched it happen from the bridge of the Carthage. Every officer on duty saw the prediction confirmed in real time. Booker stood at navigation with his hands flat on the edge of the console, staring at a set of numbers he had calculated himself and no longer trusted. Within the hour, Stokes issued a religious directive across all ships. Questioning the Oracle trajectory was blasphemy, punishable under both fleet religious law and the military code he had learned to graft onto it. By morning, Booker came to my ready room and quietly asked for reassignment off the bridge. He gave no reason. The reason was visible in how he avoided meeting my eyes. A man who had touched forbidden math and then watched the forbidden prove itself right. The prediction defied every conventional explanation I could reach for. I had nothing to counter it, and that absence was already doing the work of proof. The crew of the Carthage went to their racks that night, believing the entity guiding the fleet could see forward through time, and had just demonstrated it by saving 600 lives aboard the Dunmore. My challenge to the mandate had collapsed into a question of trust, an admiral's forbidden calculation, or an oracle's confirmed prophecy. 6 days after the decree, the Providence broke formation. She was a civilian arkship, one of the largest vessels in the fleet, converted from a colony transport during the evacuation of the Reach. Roughly 4,000 refugees were aboard. Families, children, elderly, tradespeople, medical staff. Her captain was a civilian named Gantry, who had been a harbour pilot before the collapse, promoted to arkship command the way everyone in this fleet had been promoted, by being alive when the previous man wasn't. Gantry burned hard. The Providence's engines were old but powerful, and she opened a gap in the formation fast enough that the alert reached my tactical display before anyone on the religious channel understood what was happening. His broadcast was brief and carried the dead calm of a man who had weighed his options to the gram. He would not carry 4,000 passengers into a black hole. Any ship that wanted to follow him out was welcome. Stokes was on my bridge within 3 minutes. The Providence must be destroyed. He said it the way a man discusses drainage, a regrettable necessity. The Providence was in apostasy. Breaking formation during a divine mandate fractured the fleet's spiritual integrity. Religious law required the destruction of the apostate vessel before the contagion spread. 4,000 people are aboard that ship, Commander. 4,000 souls in rebellion against the divine course. If the Providence is permitted to flee, other ships will follow. The mandate collapses. The fleet fragments in dead star space without oracle guidance, and everyone dies scattered instead of being saved together. 2 escort frigates, the Kendrick and the Hale, broke from their screening positions and accelerated towards the Providence on intercept headings. I hadn't ordered them to move. Their captains were zealots, both of them, men who had risen through the priest-officer structure and held military commissions because the fleet's command hierarchy had fused with its religious one across 14 months of shared desperation. The Kendrick was already charging weapons. I had 3 choices, and all of them bled. Destroy the Providence, kill 4,000 civilians, seal the mandate's authority, hold the fleet together on a heading that would murder everyone in 11 days. Let the Providence go, abandon 4,000 people to dead star space without oracle navigation, risk a cascade of defections, and watch fleet order dissolve through visible inaction. Protect the Providence, burn the last of my compliance, defy the religious command structure openly, and force a confrontation I was nowhere near ready for. Kendrick, this is Carthage, actual. Break off your intercept and return to screening position. Acknowledge and comply. Silence on the military channel. The Kendrick kept accelerating. Hale, same order. Break off and return to formation. The Hale's captain acknowledged. He adjusted heading and fell back into the screening line. The Kendrick kept closing. She fired a warning salvo across the Providence's bow, the plasma discharge bright enough to have been visible through the Ark ship's forward viewports, bright enough for 4,000 refugees to see. Kendrick, you will break off or I will fire on you. This is Admiral Hadley. Confirm you are receiving. The Kendrick's captain came back on the channel. His voice carried the measured certainty of a man who believed he answered to a higher authority than fleet command. Admiral, the Providence is in open apostasy. Fleet Religious Directive 77 requires Fleet Military Directive 1 requires you to follow a direct order from your commanding officer. Break off or I put a round through your engine block. You have 30 seconds to comply. I ordered the Carthage's forward batteries armed. My weapons officer, a young man named Pratt, who had been pressing 2 fingers to his collarbone 6 days ago, powered them up and locked targeting solutions on the Kendrick without a word of hesitation. Whatever his private faith, he understood the chain of command when a senior officer used that tone. The Kendrick broke off. She came about and returned to formation, and her captain went silent on every channel. The Providence burned away on a perpendicular heading, her drive signature shrinking on my tactical display until the radiation noise of the Dead Star corridor swallowed it. 4,000 people flying without oracle guidance through a region of space where conventional instruments could barely distinguish between safe passage and a killing field of trapped radiation. I had kept the Kendrick from putting a volley through her hull and delivered those 4,000 to a slower, quieter kind of danger. Stokes stood on my bridge and watched the Providence vanish from the scope. He said nothing to me directly. He left, and within 20 minutes, I received reports from 6 ships that their priest officers had declared my military authority spiritually compromised. Under the religious code Stokes had built that authorized crew members to disobey orders that contradicted Oracle mandate. The religious communication channel, the one that paralleled mine, that reached every soul on every ship, carried the declaration faster than I could draft a response. Captain Dale Fenton found me in my ready room an hour later. Fenton commanded the Marine detachment aboard the Carthage, 40 combat-trained men who reported directly to me through the military chain and who had, up to this point, stayed clear of the religious hierarchy. He was a career Marine, old enough to have served garrison duty in the Reach before the collapse, loyal in the plain way professional soldiers are loyal, to the man who signs their orders until he signs one they can't stomach. Admiral, you need to know what's happening. The Marine detachments on the Alderson, the Threshold, the Braddock and the Sutter have split. Half are standing with their ship captains. Half have gone over to their priest officers. On the Franklin, the Marines disarmed and confined their own captain 2 hours ago on a priest officer's authority. He's alive, but he's sitting in a cargo hold, under armed guard. How long do I have? Fenton weighed the question like a man loading a scale. If you're asking how long before you give an order and the fleet treats it as optional. Days. Maybe fewer. The Providence was a test, Admiral, and you gave the wrong answer for about 2/3 of the people under your command. I studied the tactical display. 30 ships remained in formation, including the Carthage. 11 days to cradle 881's Accretion disk. The Providence was already gone. Beacon dark, escort absent, godless in the corridor. Fenton was still standing in the doorway, waiting. Dale, I need you to start thinking about the navigation cathedral. Access points, security rotation, internal layout, everything Stokes controls. He understood. His expression stayed flat, a Marine who has just received an order that rearranges the rest of his life. He nodded once, turned, and left to begin the work that would either save the fleet or finish what the black hole had started. 9 days after the decree, Baines issued the order that made compromise impossible. His modified voice filled every corridor, mess hall, bunk room, and bridge across the fleet in the liturgical cadence that had become the sound of authority itself. Before the fleet entered the Accretion disk, the sinful would be separated from the faithful. Refugees deemed insufficiently devout, anyone who had spoken in sympathy with the Providence's flight, anyone who had questioned the mandate publicly, anyone whose priest officer judged their belief inadequate, would be transferred to cargo haulers stripped of radiation shielding. These vessels, redesignated as pilgrimage ships, would enter the disk ahead of the main fleet as a spiritual vanguard. The sinful would go first. They would be purified by passage or consumed by it, and either outcome would sanctify the path for the faithful who followed. The first manifests arrived before the broadcast had finished. 312 names from the Alderson, 204 from the Threshold, 47 from the Roebuck, including 3 engineers whose only recorded offence was refusing to sign a statement of devotion. The lists came through the religious channel as if they were cargo tallies. I stood at my tactical display and did the math that the decree's liturgical language was designed to obscure. Unshielded cargo haulers entering an Accretion disk would expose their passengers to radiation that would kill within minutes, faster if the tidal forces crushed the hulls first. The pilgrimage vessels were execution chambers with drive engines. Every officer on my bridge understood this at some depth, but 14 months of faith had relabeled killing as sacrifice. Stokes stood near the communication station, watching me, waiting for compliance or heresy. Either one would serve his position. I returned to my quarters and called Fenton on a hard line that bypassed the ship's main communications grid. The cathedral. How soon? 48 hours to have my people in position and Stokes's security rotation mapped down to the minute. Faster if you want it ugly. Make it 36, and I need access to the cathedral's life support trunk, the maintenance crawl on Deck 9 that feeds air and thermal into the oracle compartment. Fenton was quiet for 2 seconds. You want to talk to one of them? The junior, Marsh. His modifications are lighter than the others. He still comes up for cognitive assessments in the medical bay every 10 days. I've seen his file. If any of them can still think outside the signal, it's him. Fenton arranged it for that night. The life support trunk was a service crawlway barely wide enough for a man to move on hands and knees, running through the Carthage's inner hull between the cathedral's sealed compartment and the ship's main thermal exchange. Fenton's people had mapped a junction where the crawlway passed within 3 meters of the cathedral's interior wall, separated by a maintenance access panel that medical staff used for atmospheric sampling. Fenton pulled the panel. Through the gap, I could see the edge of a cradle, one of the reclining frames where the oracles lay during signal reception, and sitting on the deck beside it with his knees drawn up, Philip Marsh. He was younger than I'd expected from his file. Mid-20s, but the modifications made age harder to read. The capillary changes around his eyes gave his skin a bruised, translucent quality, and his fingers twitched in small patterns that tracked something I couldn't hear. He startled when Fenton whispered his name through the gap, then crawled close enough that I could see fear working through his face like current through water. "Marsh, I'm Admiral Hadley. I need you to answer some questions and I need you to be precise." "They'll hear me. The others. They hear everything in here." The signal carries. "Baines is in deep reception. The monitors show him under. The other 3 are sedated for rest cycle. You have maybe 20 minutes. Is the signal real?" He pressed his palms flat against the deck as if anchoring himself. "Yes, it's real. I can feel it in my..." It comes through the modification sites, the neural grafts. The radiation from Cradle 881 carries structured data that our systems translate into spatial coordinates. The navigation has been accurate. Every corridor we've threaded, every radiation pocket we've avoided, the signal guided us through all of it. And the prediction, the Dunmore's engine. Marsh's fingers twitched faster. The signal carries more than navigation. As we get closer to the source, the data density increases. Baines can read layers I can't reach. System states, material stress patterns, temporal modeling. He saw the bearing failure because the signal showed it to him. Whatever is generating the signal can model our ships from a distance or it's... He stopped. From somewhere deeper in the cathedral, a cradle motor clicked and adjusted its angle. Marsh went still until the sound faded. "Or it's influencing the failures to prove it can predict them," he said. "The route through the accretion disk. Is that in the signal?" This was the question that mattered, and Marsh knew it. He closed his eyes, and the bruised skin around them darkened as capillaries dilated, a physical sign of his modifications engaging even through his fear. The signal provides navigational data. Coordinates, hazard mapping, corridor identification. It threads us through dead star space the same way a chart threads a ship through shoals. The raw data shows a route that approaches Cradle 881 and uses its gravity as a slingshot, a course correction that would redirect the fleet toward viable star systems on the far side. That's what the base signal contains. He opened his eyes. The route through the accretion disk, the direct entry, the passage into the disk itself, that's Baines's interpretation. He layers theology onto the raw coordinates. The signal says approach. Baines says enter. And because his modifications are deeper than mine, because he's been the primary interpreter for 14 months, nobody questions the difference. You can navigate without the disk entry. I can read the raw signal and calculate approaches, corridors, gravitational assists. My interpretations carry more error than Baines's. My modifications are shallower, the resolution is lower, and the signal intensity this close to the source is starting to cause bleed in my grafts. He touched the skin behind his right ear, where a dark line traced the path of an implanted receiver. I can get the fleet through dead star space. I can use the signal's data. I'll burn out faster than Baines, and my margins will be wider. You'd be navigating with a rougher chart. A rough chart that keeps the fleet alive, or a perfect chart that feeds it into a black hole. Marsh said nothing. His fingers kept twitching. I told him what I needed. When the Marines breached the cathedral, Marsh would cooperate. He would allow himself to be moved to the auxiliary navigation station on Deck 4. He would continue reading the signal and providing course data without Baines's theological overlay. In return, I would keep him alive, keep him supplied with the medications that managed his modification side effects, and keep him away from Stokes. He agreed with the resigned terror of a man who understood that every available option would cost him something he couldn't replace. Fenton sealed the panel. We crawled back through the maintenance trunk in the dark, and over the next 36 hours, Fenton positioned his Marines at the 3 access points to the navigation cathedral, mapped Stokes's security detail down to their shift breaks and personal habits, and identified which of his own people would fight for the fleet's admiral, and which would freeze when the order came. The operation was set for 6 hours before the surveyed abort threshold, the last point, according to the old charts, where the fleet could still alter course and retain enough fuel to reach a viable system. 6 hours of margin. Enough to execute the seizure, burn away from the disk entry vector, and reach minimum safe distance before the fuel calculations went terminal. That was the plan. The plan assumed Cradle 881 had the mass the surveys said it did. Fenton's Marines hit the cathedral at 0400 ship time. 2 teams breached simultaneously from the primary and secondary access corridors, while a third made noise at the tertiary hatch, enough to pull Stokes's guards toward the wrong door. I stayed on the bridge, where my job was to lock down fleet communications before the priest officers on other ships could organize a response. Pratt, my weapons officer, had spent the previous 12 hours rigging a communications override that would give me sole control of the military broadcast channel for approximately 90 minutes before Stokes's people on other ships found workarounds. The fighting in the corridors was brief and savage. Fenton's people were career Marines. Stokes's security were true believers with sidearms and the conviction that dying in defense of the oracles earned divine favor. 3 of Stokes's guards died in the first exchange. 2 of Fenton's Marines took injuries. 1 serious, a chest wound from a guard who had wedged himself into an alcove and fired into the breach team at close range. Fenton put him down and kept moving. I heard the engagement through Fenton's hardline, compressed to tactical shorthand, and the sounds of men working in close quarters with weapons. The bridge crew watched their stations and pretended the sounds coming through the command speaker were routine. Every one of them knew what was happening 3 decks below. "Cathedral secure," Fenton reported. 4 guards down, 2 surrendered. "Stokes is in custody. He was inside when we breached. The oracles are in their cradles. Baines is—" A pause. "Admiral, you should hear this yourself." I patched the cathedral's internal audio to my station. Baines was talking. His voice carried that deep, subharmonic vibration, the one that made metal surfaces resonate in sympathy, and he spoke with the calm of a man who had expected this and already accounted for it. "Admiral Hadley, the signal thanks you for your service." I kept my voice professional. The bridge crew was listening. "Baines, the cathedral is under military authority. Your navigation mandate has been suspended. The fleet will change course under my orders." "Your course change is part of the pattern, Admiral. Resistance is a form of approach. The signal has modelled this outcome and incorporated it. Check your positional data. Since Captain Fenton's men entered this compartment, the fleet has drifted 612 meters closer to optimal disk entry trajectory. Your engines stayed idle. Your navigators held heading. The drift is gravitational." I looked at Booker. I had ordered him back to bridge duty 48 hours ago, unhappy, frightened, but obedient. He was already running the positional check, and the colour was leaving his face as the numbers resolved. "He's right, Admiral. 600 meters of positional drift toward the accretion disk since 0400. It's gravitational capture. We're deeper inside the influence envelope than our charts predicted." "Cause?" "The black hole's mass is wrong. Every survey we have, every long-range reading, the actual mass is at least 40% greater than anything on record. Our abort threshold was calculated against the surveyed mass." "Where is the real threshold?" Booker's hands moved across his console. The answer came in a voice scraped clean of everything except the math. "We crossed the outer capture threshold 3 days ago. We are inside the envelope." The bridge went still. "Can we break free?" "With an immediate full burn on every operational engine in the fleet." "Yes. Marginally. It will cost most of our remaining fuel reserves. We'd come out with enough to reach the Garrity system maybe, if Oracle navigation can thread us through the Dead Star corridors between here and there. Without Oracle guidance, we'd burn everything we have, and still fly blind into the first radiation pocket we hit. Baines's voice came through the cathedral audio again. "You cannot steer without us, Admiral. You cannot navigate without the signal, and the signal wants what it has always wanted. Bring the fleet home." "Sedate him," I told Fenton. "Sedate all of them except Marsh. Get Marsh to the auxiliary navigation station on Deck 4. Move." Through the hard line, I heard the medic Fenton had brought. Injector cartridges. Baines's voice continuing its calm, prophetic cadence, even as the sedative hit his bloodstream, the words slowing but never stopping, dropping into that sub-harmonic register until they became vibration, and then silence. Stokes's voice cut through from wherever Fenton's men were holding him. "Every ship in the fleet received the High Oracle's final broadcast, Admiral. He triggered it before your Marines reached the inner door. The faithful know what you've done. They know the heretic Admiral has seized God's instruments, and they will act." He was right. Within minutes, ships began to fall away from military command. The Braddock went first. Her executive officer started a status report, stopped mid-sentence, and came back breathing hard while prayer surged behind him. The transmission cut out before he could say whether the captain was alive. The Sutter went dark entirely. On the Franklin, whose captain was already confined, the priest officer formally declared separation from Fleet Military Command. 5 more ships followed in the next 12 minutes, some seized by zealot crews, some choosing the mandate through their captains, all of them refusing my recall. I stood at the tactical display and watched the fleet fracture in real time. 30 ships, including the Carthage. 8 were gone, 5 seized by zealots, 2 silent, 1 whose captain had chosen the mandate over my orders. 22 remained under military authority, their captains confirming loyalty through the communications channel I still controlled. 22 ships. Enough fuel for 1 full burn. A junior oracle with shallow modifications and a rough chart, and a black hole behind us, whose gravity had been pulling the fleet toward it for 3 days longer than anyone had known. "All ships under Fleet Military Command, this is Admiral Hadley. Execute emergency course change on my mark. Full burn, heading 274 by 018. Sustained thrust for maximum duration. Acknowledge and comply." The acknowledgements came back one by one, some immediate, some after a pause that carried the weight of officers choosing their admiral over their god. Booker did not pray. He kept his hands on the console and fed the heading to every ship that would still take it. The Carthage shuddered as her main engines fired at full output. Across the formation, 21 other ships did the same, their drive signatures flaring on the tactical display like a ragged constellation turning its back on the dark. The burn lasted 7 hours. 7 hours of sustained thrust against the gravitational pull of a black hole that outweighed every chart, every survey, and every calculation the fleet had ever trusted. The Carthage's hull groaned with the structural stress of fighting physics at an angle the ship's designers had never anticipated. I stayed on the bridge for all of it, watching the positional data change degree by degree as the fleet clawed away from Cradle 881's capture envelope. 3 ships couldn't hold the burn. The Pershing was the first. The bypass we had kept alive with prayer, wire, and exhausted engineers ruptured under sustained thermal load 90 minutes into the maneuver. Her captain fought to keep the coolant failure from cascading through the whole drive assembly, but every reduction in thrust let the black hole take back distance. 260 people were aboard. I watched her marker begin to curve. The Roebuck followed 2 hours later. The aft compartment welds failed under acceleration, and the tanker vented pressure in a white plume that glittered for 6 seconds on long-range optical before radiation noise swallowed the image. Her crew sealed what they could and tried to keep the main tank stable, but her engines throttled down to prevent ignition. She dropped behind the formation with 88 people aboard and enough fuel in her belly to matter to everyone except herself. The Osborne, a troop carrier with 614 people aboard, lost her primary drive 4 hours in. Metal fatigue, 14 months of hard running through dead star space had eaten her engine mounts down to fracture points, and the sustained full burn tore them apart. She kept firing on secondaries, but the thrust differential was too great. She fell behind the formation, her drive output dropping, while the black hole's pull stayed constant. I watched the 3 signatures on my tactical display as they bent along the gravitational curve, each position update pulling them farther from the fleet's heading and closer to the trajectory we had just spent 7 hours of fuel to escape. The Osborne's captain, a man named Weber, sent a final status report in the plain language of a professional who understood his numbers. He could maintain secondary thrust for another 11 hours, but his heading was locked by the gravity differential. He was asking if I had options, and the way he asked told me he already knew the answer. Our reserves were empty for rescue, and every possible tow ship was too far away. I told him his cruise service would be recorded. He acknowledged and closed the channel, and I kept my eyes on his ship's trajectory marker as it traced a long, slow parabola back toward the black hole. 962 people across the 3 vessels. The morning report had warned me. I had spent the first hour of my watch trying to keep the fleet from dropping to 29, and now the number was 19. The 8 ships that had stayed behind under the mandate were already deeper into the capture envelope, still on the Oracle heading, still broadcasting fragments of prayer and liturgical chant across the diminishing communications range. As the fleet pulled away, those broadcasts grew weaker, broken by radiation interference, until they became sequences of syllables and silence. Then just silence. The Providence remained absent from every sweep. Beacon dark, rubble absent, every hail unanswered. Marsh navigated from the auxiliary station on deck 4. He sat in a converted sensor chair, surrounded by equipment designed for conventional stellar cartography that Booker's team had jury-rigged to display the Oracle signal's raw data output. Marsh read the signal the way his modified nervous system had been built to read it, through the implanted receivers behind his ears, through the altered visual cortex that translated radiation bursts into spatial geometry, through the capillary networks around his eyes that processed data his conscious mind couldn't handle fast enough. He received the signal, stripped Baines's theological interpretation from the raw coordinates, and produced course corrections that threaded the fleet through dead star corridors using the same data the High Oracle had used, minus the destination that would kill everyone aboard. His navigation worked. The corrections were rougher than Baines's, wider error margins, longer intervals between updates, occasional second-guessing that forced Booker to run parallel checks on conventional instruments. But the signal's core data was accurate. The corridors it mapped were real. The radiation pockets it flagged were exactly where it said they were. The fleet moved through dead star space on Marsh's guidance the way a man moves through a darkened room with one hand on the wall, slower, clumsier, but alive. The cost was visible. After each extended reception session, Marsh bled from his ears. The capillary networks around his eyes darkened from bruised purple to a deep, vascular red that looked like something rupturing beneath the skin. His hands tremored with the same sub-frequency patterns I'd seen in Baines, though less intense, less controlled. The ship's surgeon told me Marsh's neural grafts were degrading under the signal's intensity at this range. The modifications that let him read stellar radiation were burning out under the volume of data the black hole was producing, the way a microphone burns out when you put it next to a jet engine. He had weeks of functional reception remaining. Maybe months. Beyond that, the surgeon wouldn't guess. On the second day after the burn, Marsh asked to speak with me. I went to the auxiliary station and found him sitting in the sensor chair with his hands flat on the console, steadying the tremors. Blood had dried in a dark line from his right ear to his collar. "Admiral, I need to tell you something about the signal." "Go ahead." "It hasn't changed. Since the course correction, since you broke from the mandate and burned away from the disk, The signal has continued to provide navigational data at the same density, the same accuracy, the same structural coherence as before. Every corridor I've mapped since the burn has been confirmed by conventional instruments within the error margin. The signal is still helping us, Admiral. Whatever is generating it, whatever is inside or beyond Cradle 881, it is still providing accurate navigation to a fleet that refused its mandate. It hasn't withdrawn guidance. It hasn't degraded the data. It hasn't punished the rebellion. What does that mean? I don't know what it means. I can tell you what it's doing. The signal is currently providing route data that takes the fleet toward the Garrity system. The exact heading you ordered. The optimal path through the dead star corridors between here and the nearest viable stars. It's giving us exactly what you asked for. I absorbed this in the sensor chair's pale operational glow, surrounded by equipment that droned with the baseline vibration of a ship's electrical system pushed to its limits. The signal was still helping. The god, the entity, the phenomenon, the structured intelligence embedded in a black hole's radiation output, was still guiding the fleet toward the destination I had chosen. I left Marsh and went to the cathedral. Fenton had posted guards at every access point, and the compartment was sealed under military lockdown. The other 3 oracles had been transferred to the medical bay under sedation. Baines remained in his cradle, sedated, monitored by medical staff who reported his vitals every 4 hours. The medic on duty, a young corpsman named Garrett, met me at the inner door. "Admiral, I flagged something in the overnight monitoring. High Oracle Baines has been vocalizing under sedation for the past 18 hours. Continuous low-frequency output, subharmonic, consistent with signal reception patterns. We've increased the sedative twice. The vocalization hasn't stopped." "What frequency?" Garrett checked his tablet. "It shifted about 6 hours ago. The pitch changed, the modulation pattern restructured. I compared it against the signal data Lieutenant Marsh has been receiving at the auxiliary station." He turned the tablet so I could see the waveform comparison. 2 signals, one from Marsh's receivers and one from the microphone, monitoring Baines's unconscious voice. The patterns matched. "He's tracking the new heading, Admiral. The vocalization frequency corresponds to the navigational data for our current course. The course you ordered." I looked through the cathedral's inner viewport at Baines, prone in his cradle, eyes closed, mouth barely open, the luminous fluid still seeping from his tear ducts in slow trails that ran into the drainage channels built into the cradle's headrest. His lips moved, shaping sounds that mapped to the mathematics of the fleet's escape route. The route away from his god. The signal was singing it through him anyway. I walked back to the bridge. The tactical display showed 19 ships holding formation on Marsh's latest heading, driving toward the Garrity system through a corridor of dead stars that the signal had mapped for us. Behind the fleet, visible on long-range sensors, Cradle 881's radiation output had increased by 4% since our course change, whether from natural stellar process or something else the instruments couldn't say. Booker was at his station, running the numbers he'd been running every 6 hours since the burn. Fuel reserves, heading confirmation, corridor integrity, signal reliability. He looked up when I entered. "Admiral, the signal data Marsh provided for the next 12-hour window checks out against conventional instruments. The corridor is clean. We're on track for Garrity in approximately 41 days at current burn rate." I sat in the command chair. 19 ships, critical fuel, a crew still bleeding from the schism. Some mourning the faithful we had left behind, some terrified that defying the Oracle had doomed the fleet. Some simply exhausted past the point where belief or disbelief mattered more than sleep. A junior Oracle whose brain was slowly burning itself out reading a signal he couldn't refuse, providing navigation the fleet could not survive without, interpreting data that originated from the exact entity I had just spent every remaining resource to escape. I could not fire the oracles. I could not shut down the signal. I could not navigate Dead Star space without modified brains that translated the signal's data into coordinates my instruments couldn't generate. I had broken the mandate, shattered the church, split the fleet, and spent the fuel. At the end of all of it, I was still following the signal,